Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the second Digestive System lecture. This will cover structure and function of the oral cavity, the pharynx, and the esophagus. Course competencies 3 and 4 have study questions for you to answer regarding these three regions of the digestive tract. So the functions of the oral cavity include ingestion, mastication, which is chewing, mechanical digestion, some chemical digestion, but only carbohydrate, and swallowing, which is known as deglutition. In terms of histology, the most noteworthy layer of the oral cavity is the mucosa. It's composed of thick stratified squamous epithelium that helps protect the tube or the alimentary canal from abrasion as food is ingested, chewed, and swallowed. In the hard palate region, the mucosa has ridges which provide friction when we manipulate our food. The soft palate contains a layer of smooth muscle. This is important because it rises to close off the nasopharynx when we swallow so that food doesn't go into our nasal cavity. There's some debate about the function of the uvula. It projects downward at the back of the oral cavity. It may play a role in keeping food in the oral cavity before it's ready to be swallowed. And the tongue is involved in food manipulation, taste, and swallowing. And of course, the teeth are needed for mechanical digestion. We refer to the teeth as dentition, so they perform mechanical breakdown of food. So I'll discuss the tongue a little bit. The tongue is largely composed of muscle. And the muscles that make up the tongue are referred to as intrinsic muscles, intrinsic meaning within the tongue. When they contract, these muscles change the shape of the tongue, and that aids in swallowing. It also aids in food manipulation, but mainly swallowing. There are also extrinsic muscles that attach the tongue to bones, to the mandible and to the hyoid bone. When these muscles contract, the tongue can protrude, retract, and move side to side. These muscles are important then, excuse me, during ingesting food, like licking an ice cream cone, and during manipulation of food. On the tongue, there are taste buds, and there's various types. They all lie beneath the mucosa. They're referred to as papilla because they project upward, I guess. The foliate papilla are located on the posterior lateral surface of the tongue, right here. The valate papilla are in a V-shaped row at the posterior surface of the tongue, back of the tongue. And the fungiform papilla are really scattered throughout the surface of the tongue, as are the filiform papilla. There's three types that have taste buds, and that's the foliate, the valate, and the fungiform. The filiform papilla don't contain receptors for chemicals, so there's no taste associated with them, but they provide friction during food manipulation, just like the cat had filiform papilla for grooming. Associated with the oral cavity are salivary glands. We have 3 pairs of these that secrete saliva into the oral cavity through a duct. Since they use a duct, they're considered exocrine glands. So these 3 pairs are the parotid glands, the sublingual glands, and the submandibular glands. And each one produces saliva that varies in its consistency. Sometimes it's thick, sometimes it's thin. When it's thick, it has more mucus, and when it's thin, it contains relatively more water than mucus. The reason that saliva is important is it moistens our food before we swallow it. That will reduce friction as it travels through the esophagus. But also saliva performs some chemical digestion as well. So let's look at what saliva is made up of. Believe it or not, it's said that we can make up to 1.5 liters of saliva each day. That's a lot. It's largely made up of water, up to 99.5%, but it also contains mucus, electrolytes, various proteins, some digestive enzymes, and it's acidic at a pH of 6.75 to 7. Due to this acidity, the presence of lysozyme, defensins, and immunoglobulin A, it can help defend us against foodborne bacterial infections. The digestive components of saliva include amylase and lipase. There are two amylases in the digestive tract. So this amylase is referred to as salivary amylase, and it digests carbohydrates into smaller carbohydrates, oligosaccharides and disaccharides. And that happens within the oral cavity. The other digestive enzyme is a lipase digesting lipids, and there's two lipases in the digestive tract. This one is referred to as lingual lipase, produced by cells associated with the tongue. It is not active in the oral cavity. It's not until it reaches the stomach where it performs some lipid digestion. And I should mention that when we chew and moisten our food, that process of mastication will incorporate the saliva into the food bolus. So enzymes are going to move throughout the food and be able to do their work. Just that lingual lipase won't be activated until it gets into the acidic environment of the stomach. Salivation is continuously occurring and it keeps our mouth moist, but food stimulates a large increase in salivation. It's controlled primarily by the parasympathetic nervous system, and there are neurons in cranial nerves 7 and 9 that go to the salivary glands. Parasympathetic stimulation makes the saliva thinner than sympathetic stimulation does. And that's because the enzymes are going to function better in a watery environment versus a thick mucus environment. Okay, like the oral cavity, the pharynx, which receives the food bolus that we've chewed, has a mucosa, and that's composed of stratified squamous epithelium, which helps protect during abrasion. The other noteworthy feature of the pharynx is the muscularis externa. It has 3 bands of muscles. They're all called constrictors or pharyngeal constrictors. The most superior one is called the superior pharyngeal constrictor. And then there's a middle pharyngeal constrictor and an inferior pharyngeal constrictor. These contract sequentially when we swallow food. They're mainly made up of skeletal muscle, but there is some smooth muscle associated, especially with the inferior constrictor. Note that the most inferior constrictor, the blue one in this picture, is located at the very beginning of the esophagus. So for this reason, it's sometimes referred to as the upper esophageal sphincter. So once those constrictors have sequentially contracted, the food bolus will enter the esophagus. Now, in the esophagus, the mucosa is still stratified squamous epithelium. The submucosa contains some mucus glands that will help with movement of the food bolus through the esophagus. And the muscularis externa is highly adapted to allow both voluntary control and involuntary control of muscle contraction, depending on what region. So the upper 1/3 of the esophagus, in the muscularis, there's only skeletal muscle. In the lower 1/3, there's only smooth muscle. But in the middle, there's both skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. So the superior region is under voluntary somatic control, whereas the inferior most region is under only autonomic motor control. Kind of interesting. And the upper esophageal sphincter that's labeled on this diagram, I just want to remind you that's the lowest pharyngeal sphincter, as constrictor as well. And then at the base of the esophagus, the most inferior portion, there's a very thin circular muscle here called the lower esophageal sphincter. It has to relax in order for the food bolus to enter the stomach. After it enters the stomach, this sphincter can contract again to prevent regurgitation. So let's talk about swallowing in a little bit more detail. There are two phases. The technical term for swallowing again is deglutition. The first phase is called the buccal phase, and it's under voluntary motor control. The second phase has a terrible name. It's called the pharyngeal esophageal phase, and that's involuntary, controlled mainly by the parasympathetic neurons in the vagus nerve. So the phases are named according to where the food bolus is located. So just so you know, buccal or buccal, I've heard it said both ways, refers to the cheek. So the food bolus is still in the mouth during the buccal phase. But in the second phase, the pharyngeal esophageal phase, the bolus has passed from the pharynx to the esophagus, and it continues to move. In total, the whole process takes about 8 seconds to go from the top of the pharynx all the way down to the stomach. We're going to look at these two phases in slightly more detail. The first phase, the buccal phase of swallowing, the tongue pushes the bolus, the food bolus, into the back of the oral cavity or into the oral pharynx right here. And initially, this upper esophageal sphincter is relaxed, but as the bolus passes, it contracts. In the second phase, the soft palate rises to close off the nasopharynx. The epiglottis blocks the glottis so that food doesn't go through here, go into the larynx. And the upper esophageal sphincter then relaxes, and the tongue blocks the mouth, of course. At the very end of swallowing, all three pharyngeal constrictors have contracted sequentially. First the upper, then the middle, then the lower. So when the upper esophageal sphincter contracts, it pushes food into the esophagus, and it closes completely after the food bolus has passed that region. Then peristalsis occurs. This is a wave-like series of contractions in the esophagus. Initially, when the food bolus enters the esophagus, although not shown in this picture very well, the esophagus is collapsed. I think you might remember this from the cat. There's no cartilage rings, so it's collapsed. The stretch, though, from the food bolus entering stimulates the muscle to contract right superior to the food bolus. This occurs by a local reflex that's mediated through the myenteric nerve plexus. So the stretch is sensed right here, and a signal goes to this region through the myenteric nerve plexus. And that continues as the food bolus is pushed down. So now it has stretched this region. A signal will go up here to push it down a little bit farther, and it continues all the way down the length of the esophagus. Finally, the food bolus reaches the end of the esophagus where there is a thin circular muscle that I've mentioned previously that I called the lower esophageal sphincter. It can also be called the lower gastroesophageal sphincter, but most commonly you've probably heard of it as the cardiac sphincter because this is the cardiac region of the stomach. Notice that it has to relax to allow the food bolus to move forward. After it has, it then contracts and it prevents reflux or regurgitation. So that's the end of Lecture 2, Digestive System. We'll start on Monday, April 22nd with Digestive System Lecture 3. Thank you.